Hello and welcome. I'm Dominic Hale from Mining Journal. I'm here with Denise Chapman, Vice President, Global Operations, and Miriam Clark, Vice President of Global Strategy and Business Growth at Okane Consultants. Okane helps mining companies to return land responsibly and safely at the end of a mine's life cycle. And we're here today to talk about how best to optimize mine closure outcomes. Denise and Miriam, welcome. Great to have you both here.
Thank you so much, Dominic.
Can I start by asking you, Denise, to clarify for the audience what is meant by integrated as opposed to traditional mine closure planning, and what benefits this integrated approach has?
Sure, thanks, Dominic. The term integrated mine closure planning is often used to describe any activity that falls under the practice of planning for closure throughout the life of mine. So at Okane, we use the term integrated closure planning to refer to interdisciplinary teams working toward one fully integrated life of mine operating and closure plan. So even when practicing integrated mine closure planning, most operators still manage their life of mine plan and their closure plan as separate documents. So this means that any updates to the closure plan often lag behind the material changes in the life of mine. So here at Okane, we advocate for one fully integrated life of mine operating and closure plan. It creates better opportunities to consider the full life cycle of the mine. It considers impacts of material characterization, management in the life of mine plan, and to establish the long-term geotechnical and geochemical stability during operations.
So in line with that push to be more integrated, to be early to the party and to perhaps re-baseline at regular intervals, if I could ask you, Miriam, are you seeing evidence of greater multi-stakeholder collaboration within organizations of a greater cross-discipline or cross-role approach to mine closure than has previously perhaps been the case, whether that's increased information sharing, communication, or better coordination for enhanced outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely, Dominic. I think the important thing to remember is that mine closure planning has always been a multidisciplinary field, but recently we're seeing a much higher increased appreciation for the integration of socioeconomic impacts into closure objectives. So one of the things that we're really focused on is creating an interdisciplinary team, not just multidisciplinary experts working independently, but experts in all fields being brought together to leverage their unique domain expertise to achieve sort of those shared outcomes. The reality is that mine sites planning for closure really need to navigate a large range of local, international, and regulatory requirements, but as well as industry standards and best practices. They also need to be able to navigate evolving stakeholder expectations. So one of the most important things when developing those interdisciplinary teams and understanding how to approach mine closure is really developing a mine closure vision. And the mine closure vision needs to not only consider the key regulatory requirements or the key environmental requirements, but it also needs to consider the socioeconomic and community transition, as well as long-term regional economic stability. So to meet those requirements, that sometimes there are conflicting expectations. And so it's really critical that mine operators establish and gain alignment on their closure visions with those multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams that include stakeholders, lands rights holders, and regulatory bodies. That's one of the reasons why we facilitate sort of closure vision workshops to create that sort of interdisciplinary approach and understand the key foundation of the mine closure plan that will uncover the best and highest value future land use potential.
So there's plenty of reasons to be cheerful, but what would you describe as the chief obstacles at present to achieving better ESG outcomes? Are things, would you say, moving in the right direction? And what more can and should be done to catalyze positive change and promote best practice? If I could direct that question to you, Miriam.
Yeah, it might seem a little odd, but I think one of the key obstacles might actually be the language that we use to describe mine closure. If you think about it, mine operators and regulators often use terms like end land use to describe the future of post-mining mine-affected lands. So we kind of like to challenge that end land use language, and we like to use instead terms like returning land use or future land use potential. Because in this way, closure visioning really takes into consideration the long-term legacy of mine-affected landscapes rather than reducing reclamation and closure planning just to only return a previous ecological function. We also really want to be sensitive to the fact that end land use really fails to consider the potential opportunities that mine-affected lands can have, and discounts the historical and future significance that land has to the affected communities and also Indigenous rights holders. So we think that, changing the language just a little bit, shifting the language will actually create more positive outcomes and create opportunities to think of mine closure as actually land use transition. And rather than planning for the end, we're actually planning for future opportunities. And if I could just, when we're talking about language, I'd be bereft if I didn't point out that Okane likes to challenge the term cap. Oftentimes mining industries, experts will use the term capping to describe a cover system. And I think I maybe would ask Denise to just talk a little bit about why we don't use that terminology, and maybe share an example of some of the cover system work that Okane's led.
Yes, please, wonderful. Do enlighten us, Denise, please.
Sure. So at Okane, over our 20 years of experience of working with designing the covers for mine waste storage facilities, cover system is the preferred language that we like to use. As in the system, it's not only a layers that we put over a mine waste facility, but it's just one part of the overall closure puzzle, which also integrates the landform design, the material characteristics of the mine waste facility, the site characteristics, all which contribute to the success of closure and achieving that return land use that Miriam was speaking of. So we were fortunate to be involved in cover system studies over decades and just understanding that interaction with the landform, the site, the materials, and how the system of the cover results in that success. So recently we completed an autopsy of a site that we've been monitoring for over 17 years in Western Australia. And what we wanted to do is understand what that cover system, how it integrated with the landform, the materials, the site characteristics, the climate, and see how those materials in the cover system achieve the end land use goal in revegetation of the site. And what we found, very interesting information, that we could take the cover system, look at the different thicknesses and how the vegetation was successful, and we could advise the site on different strategies for closure with the cover system and how it interacted with the overall site characteristics.
That is fascinating. And in terms of the latest innovations that are already having an effect, what are the recent developments in the mine closure space, whether that's technological, regulatory, or perhaps something else entirely, are you most excited about, Denise, and why is that?
I would say it's not really a recent development, but more of a growing appreciation in the industry that mine closure planners have expertise in designing for climate change resiliency. So when we think about designing for closure, timeframes can be more than 100 years. So any returning land use plan is subject to those changes in climate. So that deeper understanding of how the climate, it will be a key part of that closure, I think is an exciting thing that is developing. Here at Okane, we have a modeling team that has evolved our expertise over time to develop climate change scenario modeling. So we consider the representative concentration pathways and shared socioeconomic pathways to develop some site-specific climate databases to integrate that climate change resiliency into our design. So typically, approach we commonly see is for when climate change is integrated into designs, it is the worst case scenario that's selected. So not really understanding that the scenario might not be the worst case for that site. So for example, if we choose a site, worst case scenario, it might be conservative when we're looking at the water quality for the site, but scenario might not be the best in terms of the watershed volume intensity of the water that's being received at the site. So just those developing, appreciating the site-specific climate change risk and integrating it into the mine closure space, I think is a really important program area and focus in our mine closure space.
Fantastic. Well, look, that has been incredibly enlightening. Is there anything else that either yourself, Denise, or Miriam would like to add to what we've been discussing today?
I think the only thing we'd say is that I think that the renewed focus on mine closure planning as integrated part in the entire life of mine is really important. And I think that just seeing that growing appreciation and that focus that mining operators are now taking towards mine closure and returning land use planning is really promising. And yeah, we're looking forward to continuing to support that.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you both so much. I'm Dominic Hale for Mining Journal. I've been talking today with Denise Chapman, Vice President of Global Operations, and Miriam Clark, Vice President of Global Strategy and Business Growth at Okane Consultants.